Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of the History Desk. I'm Jonathan. Thank you for tuning in this week. Last week, we discussed Rogers Rangers, Queen's Rangers, or Simcoe's Rangers, and John Graves Simcoe himself, and how he made his mark on both the Revolutionary War and North America, and especially his work in Canada. This week, we're going to start our series on the American Revolutionary War. So let's get those powdered wigs ready, and let's go. The British government sought to regulate trade in the colonies as early as 1651 with the passing of the Navigation Acts on October 9th. This act pursued a mercantilist policy in the colonies, which was intended to make sure that trade enriched Great Britain, but prohibited trade with any other nations, extremely limiting the trade options of the colonists. The acts also prohibited British colonial producers from growing tobacco and encouraged shipbuilding in the New England colonies. In the end, the economic impact was actually minimal to the colonists, but the merchants that were affected the most were the most politically active, causing these acts to be seem like they were more detrimental to the economic gain of the colonists than they actually were. From 1675 to 1678, the colonists fought King Philip's War against indigenous inhabitants of New England, with the indigenous allies on their side without any assistance from England. This led to the development of a unique identity for the colonists that was separate from the British people. King Charles II determined to bring the New England colonies under a more centralized control in the 1680s, for trade to far benefit the homeland. New England colonists opposed these efforts with protests, which caused the Crown to nullify their colonial charters. Charles's heir, James II, finished this work in 1686 by establishing the Consolidated Dominion of New England. The Dominion of New England was the union of English colonies covering both New England and the Mid-Atlantic colonies except for Delaware and Pennsylvania. It changed the way the colonies were governed, making them more like the Spanish style with a central governor controlling everything. The primary motivation in Parliament was not to obtain efficient administration, but to reinforce the purpose of the colonies to make England richer and pay off the debts that would be accrued by the Crown. Though outlawed by the Navigation Acts, the colonies, mainly New England, were still minting their own currency in the pine tree shilling, thwarting the efforts of the king. Furthermore, with the lack of global trade in New England, many New Englanders engaged in trade and became successfully competitors of English merchants. New Englanders were now developing workshops that might drive England of its lucrative market of manufactured goods such as textiles, leather, and ironware. To combat this plan, the Crown was to establish a uniform, all-powerful government over the northern colonies to help divert them away from manufacturing and foreign trade. Following the revocation of the Massachusetts Charter, Charles II and the Lord of Trade would move forward with a plan to establish a unified administration over at least some of the New England colonies. The objectives of the Dominion included the regulation of trade, reformation of land title practices to conform more to England methods and practice, coordination on the matters of defense, streamlining of the administration into fewer sects. The Dominion would initially comprise of the territories of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, Plymouth Colony, New Province of New Hampshire, the Province of Maine, and present-day Washington County, Rhode Island. Charles II would die before the Dominion was put into place, so King James II would be the one to enact it. The settlers of the colonies were adamantly opposed to Dominion rule as it took away their traditional way of governing and gave more control to the Crown, appointing governing parties which hampered trade and freedom of the colonists. Religious leaders in Massachusetts, led by Cotton Mayor and Increase Mayor, were opposed to Dominion rule, which at this point had been going on since May of 1688. So they organized dissent targeted at influence in the court in London. In 1687, King James made the proclamation of the Declaration of Indulgence, which granted broad religious freedom to England, but by suspending penal laws enforcing conformity to the Church of England, and allowing people to worship in their homes and religious houses as they saw fit. It also ended the requirement of affirming religious oaths before gaining employment in office. Increased Mayor sent a letter to the king thanking him for the decision and suggested that other religious leaders do the same to garner favor for their fight against Dominion rule. 10 other pastors would send letters as well, and they were also decided to send Mayor to England to have him press their case against Dominion rule. Mather was arrested by Dominion officials and tried, but was exonerated in all but one of the charges. But after he was released, another arrest warrant was issued with new charges, but before he could be arrested, Mather was secreted away by boat to England. He and other religious leaders were well received by King James II, who promised their colonies and their grievances would be heard. Before he could hear them, the Glorious Revolution occurred in England, and James II was deposed by his daughter, Mary II, and her husband, William II, and they took the throne. Now, with new rulers in court, the agents of the colonies would have to petition the new monarchs and the lords of trade for the restoration of the old colonial charters. Furthermore, Maher asked the Dominion leadership not to be told of the revolution, fearing that what might happen in the colonies. British officials had already dispatched a letter to the former colonial governor Simon Bradstreet, stating that the colonial charters had been illegally annulled and that he was to prepare people in the colonies for change. News of the revolution reached the colonies as early as late March. Because of this news, Bradstreet would be a possible participant in a mob that would form in the streets of Boston that would take part in the 1689 Boston Revolt on April 18, 1689. A group of pre-Dominion magistrates, along with some of the council who worked with the Dominion, joined with militias, would take the streets and arrest Dominion officials. Members of the Church of England were also arrested if they were thought to be sympathizers of the Dominion rule. Neither side would sustain any casualties during the revolt, and leaders of the former Massachusetts Bay Colony reclaimed control of the government. In other colonies, members of the governments displaced by the Dominion were returned to power. The dissolution of the Dominion presented legal problems for both Massachusetts and Plymouth. Plymouth had never had a royal charter, and the charter of Massachusetts had been revoked. Because of this, the restored governments lacked legal foundations for the existence, which would be an issue as new political opponents would make it a point to raise. There was a more serious problem for Massachusetts, who shared a long frontier with New France to its north and saw its defenders recalled after the revolt, resulting in the exposure to French and Indian rage with the outbreak of King William's War in 1689, which would be the first of 6 colonial wars fought between New France and New England before France gave up the last of its lands east of the Mississippi at the end of the French and Indian War. The cost of colonial defenses resulted in a heavy tax burden, and war made it hard to rebuild the colonies' trade post-Dominion. Agents of both colonies were working in England to fix the issue of the charter, with Increase Mather petitioning the Lord of Trades for restoration of the Massachusetts charter. King William II was apprehensive to restore the charter, as it was believed that it would lead to the return of the Puritan government, and he wanted to prevent this. The Lord of Trade's solution to the problem was to combine the two colonies with the resulting Massachusetts Bay to include the territories of Massachusetts, Plymouth, along with Martha's Vineyard and the Elizabeth Isles, which had been a part of Dukes County in the province of New York. After the failure of Dominion rule in the colonies, successive crown governments made no more attempts to restore it. Subsequent British governments did continue their efforts to tax certain goods, passing acts that regulated the trade of wool, hats, and molasses. The Molasses Act of 1733 was particularly hard on the colonists because of a significant of their trade relied on molasses. The act imposed a tax of 6 pence per gallon of imports of molasses from non-British colonies. The act was created largely at the instance of large plantation owners in the British West Indies. The act was not passed for the purpose of raising revenue, but rather to regulate trade by making British goods cheaper than those from the French West Indies. A large molasses trade had grown between the New England and the Middle colonies and the French, Dutch, and Spanish West Indian possessions. Molasses from the British West Indies, which was used to make rum in New England, was priced much higher than its competitors, and they also had no need for the large quantities of goods offered by the colonies on the mainland for trade. In the first part of the 18th century, the British West Indies was the most important trading partner for Great Britain. Because of this, Parliament was very attentive to their requests. Rather than caving to the demands to prohibit the colonies from trading with non-British islands, Parliament passed a prohibitively high tax on the import of molasses from these islands. Largely opposed by the colonists, the tax was rarely paid, and smuggling became prominent to avoid it. If the tax would have been collected, it would have effectively closed the source to New England and destroyed much of the rum industry, yet smuggling, bribery, or intimidation of customs officials effectively nullified the law. Colonial wars fought in America were also a considerable source of tension between the British and the colonists. The British captured the fortress at Louisbourg in Nova Scotia during King George's War, the third of the French and Indian Wars, but then ceded it back to France in 1748. Many New England colonists resented their lost lives, as well as the effort it took to take the fortress, only to have it given back to their enemy. The Royal Proclamation of 1763, which was issued by King George III in October of 1763, after the Treaty of Paris, which ended the last French and Indian War, withdrew the boundaries of the lands west of the new British Quebec and west of the line running along the crest of the Allegheny Mountains, making them indigenous territory and barring colonists' settlement for 2 years. Colonists were angered by this thought, and the boundary line was adjusted in a series of treaties with indigenous tribes later on. In 1764, Parliament passed the Sugar Act, which decreased the tax on sugar and molasses but provided stricter measures of enforcement and collection, making it more difficult for colonists to get around it as they had the Molasses Act. The same year, Prime Minister George Grenville proposed a direct tax on the colonists to raise revenue, but delayed this plan to see if the colonies themselves would propose a way to raise revenue. In 1762, Greene has asserted that the whole revenue from the colonies to Britain was only between £1,000 and £2,000 a year, yet it was costing the Crown £8,000 or £7,000 a year to collect it. In his work, The Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith wrote that Parliament was not asking the colonies to do anything more than what normal Englishmen at home were required to do. Parliament would pass the Stamp Act in March of 1765, which would impose direct tax on the colonies for the first time. All official documents, newspapers, almanacs, pamphlets were required to have stamps, even playing cards. Colonists did not object that the grounds the tax were high, as they were actually low. The average Englishman paid 25 shillings annually in tax, where Americans paid only 6 pence. What they objected to was their lack of representation in Parliament, which gave them no voice concerning legislation that affected them. During the same time, since the conclusion of the French and Indian War, the Crown had had to deal with about 1,500 politically connected British Army officers. The decision was made to keep them on active duty with full pay, but they and their men had to be stationed somewhere. It was politically unacceptable to station any army in Britain during peacetime, so the decision was made to station them and their men in the colonies and have the colonists pay them. The soldiers would have no military mission, as with France no longer a threat, they had no force to defend the colonies from. The Sons of Liberty would form shortly after the passage of the Stamp Act. This was a loosely organized political organization which was active in the 13 colonies. It would play a major role in most colonies in battling the Stamp Act. The group would disband with the repeal of the act, however the name would still be attributed to other local separatist groups leading up to the Revolution. The group used public demonstrations, boycotts, threats of violence to make sure that the British tax were unenforceable. In Boston, the Sons of Liberty would burn the records of the Vice Admiralty Court and loot the home of Chief Justice Thomas Hutchinson. Several colonial legislatures called for united action to fight the Stamp Act, and 9 colonies sent delegates to the Stamp Act Congress in New York City in November. The moderated, who were led by John Dickerson, drew up a Declaration of Rights and Grievances stating that taxes passed without representation violated their rights as Englishmen, and the colonists showed their determination by boycotting imports of British merchandise. Parliament at Westminster saw itself as a supreme lawmaking authority through the British Empire, and was thus entitled to levy any tax without colonial approval or consultation. They believed that the colonies were legally British corporations, subordinate to British Parliament, and they pointed to the history of instances where Parliament had made laws in the past and were binding in the colonies. Parliament insisted that the colonies effectively enjoyed virtual representation, with the idea that the members of Parliament, including the Lord and the Crown in Parliament, reserved the right to speak for the interests of British subjects rather for just the districts that elected them. Parliament believed the colonists enjoyed these rights, as all subjects did, as only a small minority of British population elected representatives to Parliament, but the Americans, such as James Otis, a lawyer of the American colonies, maintained that there was no one in Parliament responsible for any colonial constitutionary, so there was not virtually represented by anyone in Parliament at all. As the Rockingham government came to power in Parliament in July of 1765, it was debated as whether to repeal the Stamp Act or send an army to reinforce it. Benjamin Franklin would tell Parliament in 1766 that the Americans had already contributed heavily to the defense of the empire. He argued that the local governments had raised, outfitted, and paid 25,000 soldiers, the same as Britain, and had spent many millions from American treasuries during the French and Indian War. He also warned that further tax to pay for a war the colonists had already paid for was unjust and might bring about a rebellion. Parliament agreed and repealed the Stamp Act on February 21st, 1766, but they insisted in the Declaratory Act in March of 1766 that they still had full power to make laws for the colonies in all cases. The repeal was seen as a cause for celebration in the colonies nonetheless. In 1767, the Parliament passed the Townshend Acts, which placed taxes on a number of staple goods, including paper, glass, and tea, and established a board of customs in Boston to more regularly execute trade regulations. The new taxes were enacted on the belief that Americans only objected to internal taxes and not to external taxes such as customs taxes. Contrary to this belief, it is in a widely read pamphlet called Letter from a Farmer in Pennsylvania, John Dickerson argued against the constitutionality of the acts because they were to raise revenue, not to regulate trade. Colonists would respond to the taxes by organizing new boycotts of British goods. These boycotts would be less effective as the past ones because the goods taxed by the Townshend Acts were widely used. In February of 1768, the Assembly of Massachusetts Bay issued a letter written by Samuel Adams and James Otis Jr. to the other colonies, urging them to coordinate resistance to the acts. The governor dissolved the assembly when they refused to rescind the letter. In Boston, in 1768, a riot broke out, and over the seizure of a sloop named Liberty, owned by John Hancock, for smuggling. Customs officials were forced to flee, prompting the British to deploy troops to Boston. A Boston town meeting was called and declared that now obedience was due to parliamentary laws and called for the convening of a convention. A convention assembled but only issued a mild protest before dissolving itself. In January of 1769, Parliament responded to the unrest by activating the Treason Act of 1543, which called the subjects outside of Great Britain to face trials for treason back in England. The governor of Massachusetts was instructed to gather evidence of the treason and the threat caused widespread panic, though it was not carried out. On the evening of March 5th, 1770, a British private named Hugh White stood guard duty outside the Boston Custom House on King Street, which is now State Street. A woodmaker's apprentice, who was about 13, named Edward Garrick, called out to Captain Lieutenant John Goldfinch, accusing him of refusing to pay a bill due to Garrick's master. Goldfinch, who had settled the account on a previous day, ignored the boy. Private White told Garrick that he should show more respect to the officer, and the two men exchanged insults. Garrick then started to poke Goldfinch in the chest with his finger. Seeing this, White left his post and challenged the boy and struck him in the head with his musket. Garrick cried out in pain, and his companion, Bartholomew Broders, began to argue with White, which drew a larger crowd. Henry Knox, a 19-year-old bookseller, who would later serve as a general in the Revolution, came upon the argument and warned White not to fire because he would die for it. As the evening progressed, the crowd around White grew larger and more boisterous. Church bells would ring, which usually signaled a fire, bringing more people out to the streets. More than 50 Bostonians pressed around White, led by a mixed-raced former slave, Crispus Attucks, throwing objects at the sentry and challenging him to fire his weapon. White had taken up a somewhat safer position on the steps of the custom house, and he sought assistance. Runners alerted Captain Thomas Preston, the officer on the watch at the nearby barracks. According to his report, he dispatched a non-commissioned officer and 6 privates from the Grenadier Company of the 29th Regiment of Foot to relieve White with fixed bayonets, and he accompanied the soldiers. They pushed their way through the crowd. Henry Knox took Preston by the coat and told him to take care of his men, and if they fired, they must die. Captain Preston responded that he was well aware of it. When they reached Private White on the custom house stairs, the soldiers loaded their muskets and arrayed themselves in a semicircular formation protecting White. Preston shouted to the crowd, which by now had become 300 to 400, to disperse. The crowd continued to press around the soldiers, taunting them by yelling fire and by spitting on them and throwing snowballs and stones. Richard Palms, an innkeeper who was carrying a cudgel, approached Preston and asked if his men's weapons were loaded, to which Preston assured him they were, but they would not fire unless he ordered it. Later, in his court appearance, Preston would say that he would never have given the order, leaning to the fact that he was standing in front of his men the entire time. A thrown object struck one of the privates, and he was knocked down, causing him to lose his grip on his weapon. Once he recovered his weapon, he was reported to saying, "Damn you, fire," and discharged his weapon into the crowd, although no command was given. Palms swung his cudgel, first at the private, then at Preston, striking both in the arm. After a pause that cannot be determined of length, the other soldiers fired into the crowd, not a disciplined volley, as Preston had not given the command the soldiers to fire. At different times, and 11 were hit. 3 Americans died instantly: rope maker Samuel Gray, mariner James Caldwell, and Crispus Attucks. Samuel Maverick, a 17-year-old apprentice ivory turner, was struck by a ricocheting musket ball at the back of the crowd and died early the next morning. Irish immigrant Patrick Carr died 2 weeks later. Apprentice Christopher Monk was seriously wounded. He was crippled and died in 1870, reportedly to injuries that he sustained in the attack a decade earlier. The crowd moved away from the immediate area of the customs house, but continued to grow in nearby streets. Captain Preston immediately called out most of the 29th Regiment and adopted a defensive position in front of the State House. Acting Governor Thomas Hutchinson was summoned to scene and was forced by the movement of the crowd into the council chambers of the State House. From its balcony, he was able to minimally restore order, promising that there would be a fair inquiry into the shootings if the crowd dispersed. On March 27th, the 8 soldiers and Captain Preston and 4 civilians were indicted for murder. The civilians reported to be in the customs house and fired shots, which was unprovable. Bostonians continued to be hostile to the troops and their dependents. General Gage was convinced that the troops were doing more harm than good and ordered the 29th Regiment out of the province in May. During the days between the shootings and the trial, the media was used to sway support on both sides, and the Patriots used the shooting to try and show an ongoing idea to quell the spirit of liberty. Preston and the other military defendants were defended in court by John Adams, who, even though was a patriot, took the case to make sure the defendants received a fair trial. The jury acquitted 6 of the soldiers, where 2 were found guilty because of overwhelming evidence they had fired into the crowd. The convicted soldiers were granted reduced sentences, which reduced their sentence from death to branding of the thumb in open court. The Boston Massacre, as it was coined by patriots, became the downward spiral in the relationship between Britain and the province of Massachusetts. A new minister under Lord North came to power in later part of 1770, and Parliament withdrew all taxes except the tax on tea, giving up its efforts to raise revenue while maintaining its right to tax. This move would temporarily resolve the crisis, and the boycott of British goods largely ceased, which only the more radical patriots, such as Samuel Adams, continuing. In June of 1772, American patriots, including American merchant and statesmen from Rhode Island, burned a British warship that had run aground while vigorously enforcing unpopular trade regulations such as the Navigations Acts, which would be known as the Gaspee Affair, named for the ship which they burned. The affair was investigated for possible treason, but no action was taken. Also in 1772, it became known that the Crown intended to pay fixed salaries to the governors and judge in Massachusetts, which had been paid by local authorities before this. This was an attempt to reduce the influence of colonial representatives on their governments. Sam Adams in Boston set about creating new committees of correspondence, which linked patriots in all 13 colonies and would provide the framework for the eventual rebel government. Virginia, the largest colony, set up its committee of correspondence in 1773, of which Patrick Henry and Thomas Jefferson served. A total of about 7,000 to 8,000 patriots served on these committees on the colonial and local levels, comprising most of the leadership in their communities. Loyalists were excluded, and the committees became the leaders of the American resistance to British actions and later largely determined the war effort at the state and local level. Later, when another boycott of British goods was called for, the colonial and local committee took charge, examining merchant records and publishing the name of merchants who attempted to defy the boycott of British goods. In 1773, private letters belonging to Massachusetts Governor Thomas Hutchinson were published, where he claimed the colonists could not enjoy all English liberties, and Lieutenant Governor Andrew Oliver called for the direct payment of colonial officials. The letters' contents were used as evidence of a systematic plot against American rights, and discredited Hutchinson in the eyes of the people, and the Assembly petitioned for his recall. Benjamin Franklin, Postmaster General for the colonies at the time, acknowledged he leaked the letters, which led to him being berated by British officials and fired from his job. Parliament passed the Tea Act to lower prices of taxed tea exported to the colonies to help the British East India Company undersell the smuggled Dutch tea. Special co-signers were appointed to sell the tea to bypass the colonial merchants. The acts were opposed by those that resisted the taxes, but also by the smugglers who stood to lose big business. In most instances, the co-signers were forced to resign and the tea was turned back. But Massachusetts Governor Hutchinson refused to allow Boston merchants to give in to the pressure. A town meeting in Boston determined that the tea would not be landed and ignored a demand by the governor to disperse. On December 16, 1773, a group of men, led by Samuel Adams and dressed to invoke the appearance of indigenous people, boarded the ships of the East India Trading Company and dumped 10,000 British pounds of tea into Boston Harbor. This would be the event that would later become known as the Boston Tea Party. The British government responded by passing several acts that would come to be known as the Intolerable Acts, that further split the colonies and Great Britain. They consisted of 4 laws enacted by British Parliament. The first was the Boston Port Act, which passed in 1774 in response to the Tea Party. It closed the port of Boston until the colonists paid for the destroyed tea and the king was satisfied that order had been restored. Colonists objected the act, punished all Boston rather than just the individuals who destroyed the tea, and they were being punished without having been given an opportunity to testify in their own defense. The Massachusetts Government Act provoked even more outrage than the Port Act because it took away Massachusetts' charter and brought it under the control of British government. Under the terms of the act, almost all positions in the colonial government were to be appointed by the governor, parliament, or the king. The act was also severely limited town meetings in Massachusetts to one per year unless the governor called for one. Colonists outside of Massachusetts were worried that their governments could also be changed by Parliament. The Administration of Justice Act allowed the royal governor to order trials of accused royal officials to take place in Great Britain or elsewhere in the Empire if he decided a defendant could not get a fair trial in Massachusetts. The act stated that witnesses would be reimbursed for travel, but said nothing of lost wages, making it almost impossible for witnesses to travel to where the trial would take place. George Washington called this the Murder Act, believing that it allowed the British officials to harass Americans, then escape justice. Many colonists believed the act was unnecessary because of the fair trial received by those involved in the Boston Massacre in 1770. The Quartering Act applied to all colonies and sought to create a more effective method of housing British troops in America. In a previous act, the colonies had been required to provide housing for soldiers, but colonial legislatures had been uncooperative in doing so. The new Quartering Act allowed a governor to house soldiers in other buildings if suitable quarters were not provided. Where it was widely believed that this allowed soldiers to be quartered in occupied private homes, the act only permitted troops to be quartered in unoccupied buildings. Although unrelated to the acts, the Quebec Act was also passed at the same session of Parliament and was considered by some colonists to be one of the intolerable acts. The act expanded the territory of the province of Quebec to much of the American Midwest, which appeared to void the land claims of the Ohio Company of the region. The guaranteed to practice Catholicism, the majority religion in Canada, was seen by colonists as an establishment of a faith in the colonies which were overwhelmingly Protestant. Furthermore, colonists resented the lenient provisions granted to their enemies whom they had fought hard against during the French and Indian War. In response, Massachusetts patriots issued the Suffolk Resolves, September 9, 1774, which called for 6 acts. 1. To boycott of British imports, curtail exports, and refuse to use British products. 2. Pay no obedience to the Massachusetts Government Act or Port Bill. 3. Demand resignations to those appointed under the Massachusetts Government Act. 4. Refuse payment of taxes until the Massachusetts Government Act was repealed. 5. Support a colonial government in Massachusetts free of royal authority until the acts were repealed. And 6. Urge the colonies to raise a militia for their own people. In a less famous ride, Paul Revere would transport the resolves to the First Continental Congress, who had begun meeting on September 5th. The First Continental Congress consisted of representatives from each colony and was to serve as a vehicle for deliberation and collective action. One of the delegates, Joseph Galloway, proposed the creation of a colonial parliament that would be able to approve or disapprove of acts of the British Parliament, and his idea was not accepted. The Congress instead endorsed the proposal of John Adams, what Americans would obey Parliament, but would resist all taxes in disguise. Congress called for a boycott beginning on December 1 of 1774 of all British goods, and it would be enforced by new committees authorized by Congress. Massachusetts was declared to be in a state of rebellion in February of 1775. And here we have it. We've come from early in the colonists, and now we have one of our colonies, Massachusetts, being declared a state of rebellion, February 1775. Little things added up over time, got them to where they are. And that is going to be our stopping point for this week. Next week, we're going to go first shots to end of the American Revolution. I hope you enjoyed this week's episode. I hope you join us next week for part 2. And please feel free to like us on Facebook. Just search the History Desk. Will pop up. Same art that you'd find on your podcast. If you would like to support the channel, please go to our Patreon page. All financial support will go to improving the podcast with better equipment, sound editing software, and such like that. But until we see you next time, never stop reading, never stop learning, and enjoy your history. Goodbye, everybody.